Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're sorry we're a little bit late. We had some technical issues, but they're all resolved, and we're happy to have you here. And we're so thrilled to have Alexandra Joel. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you.
All the way from across the world in Australia. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so pleased to be here.
Thank you. So today we have another great event. The library is thrilled to have the opportunity to host a live conversation with best-selling Australian author Alexandra Joel. And I would like to say thank you very much to Rebecca also at Harper for making this event possible. So to begin with, I'm going to just share a very condensed bio to introduce our guest. Alexandra Joel is the former editor of Harper's Bazaar and of Portfolio, Australia's first magazine for working women. She has also been a regular contributor to the Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald Good Weekend magazine. She's also been a practicing psychotherapist. Alexandra has 2 children and lives in Sydney with her husband. She ensures that she visits Paris on a regular basis and can be found on Instagram at Alexandra Joel Author. Welcome once again, Alexandra, and thank you for joining us. So we understand it's not quite the same time over there in Australia, so it's morning for you.
It is the next day and it is morning, and may I apologise, I'm sure the technical problems are all on my side, but I shall endeavour to do my best.
No problem. Thank you again for being with us. So Alexandra, your love and passion for fashion and dressmaking shines throughout the novel and adds an extra layer of depth to the story.
Thank
Could you please, you're welcome, share with our audience how you became editor at Harper's Bazaar and Portfolio?
My love of fashion began when I was very small. I think I was probably about 4 or 5, and I discovered a box, and in that box were all these beautiful photographs and clippings, and they were all of my mother, because my mother was a leading model, and she was a leading model after the Second World War in the time of Christian Dior's new look. And I was just struck by these pictures because my mum looked like a fairy princess. I immediately became inspired at age 5, grabbed a pair of scissors and cut up my bedroom curtains in order to make clothes. This did not go over very well. By 10, I was making my own clothes. It was such an exciting period, I think, growing up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, so many fashions. I was completely stimulated by it. I loved the aesthetic, but I also grew to love what fashion told us about the time in which we live and the women who inhabited that time. That drew me to becoming a fashion historian. I wrote 2 books on the history of fashion in Australia. And, of course, I wrote extensively about it, being a contributing editor for Harper's Bazaar and then editor of the magazine. Dream job.
Well, congratulations. Your love of fashion definitely shines throughout the novel. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about the new look by Christian Dior? When this period, how it affected fashion in the 40s and the connection to Australia?
It's a fascinating insight that fashion provides because during the war, there was clothing rationing, there was many regulations that permitted only very skimpy skirts. You saw the boxy jackets. You weren't permitted to have pockets, large collars, frills, because there was very, very little fabric to go around. After the war, unfortunately, rationing persisted. There were still shortages. But women had done it really tough during the war. All the emphasis was on the men women had really done it tough. The men came home. The men basically resumed their roles in society and usually elbowed women out of jobs. But it was a sense amongst women of deflation, of what have we got to look forward to? You know, we've sacrificed a lot. And there on the horizon came a fresh new Paris couturier called Christian Dior, who ignored all this scarcity, all of the deprivations that had been suffered, and he designed glorious clothes for feminine women with tiny shoulders, tiny waists, and enormous swirling skirts. Well, governments across the world were in uproar. They were appalled, but women couldn't get enough of it. And it was truly a fashion revolution. And I think the first time in history that fashion ever found itself on the front page of daily newspapers. And it was the editor of American Harper's Bazaar, Carmel Snow, who said, "Christian, your clothes are so different. They have such a new look." And that is what gave it the name.
So what is the connection with Australia? Was this fact or fiction, the new look and the mannequins for Christian Dior?
Well, you may know that Australian women are an intrepid lot. Our biggest and most prestigious department store here is called David Jones. And the chief fashion buyer found out about this extraordinary trend along with everybody else and said, "We must have it for Australia." And so she took off for Paris. Now, when I say took off, it took her 8 days flying. There were so many stops along the way. She finally made it to Paris. She knocked on the door and she kept on knocking doors until she got to the Grand Master, le patron, Christian Dior himself. She proposed, this what was an outrageous proposition. I would like to be the first country in the world after Paris to show the new look, after Paris, France. And Christian Dior adored the idea. He said, "I love the idea of Australia because everything in France is so tired and jaded, and we look to the past. You are a country that is fresh and open and look to the future." So where was this groundbreaking collection seen? The very first time it was shown after Paris, France, amazingly, was in Sydney, Australia, at David Jones. So that is all completely true.
So before I delve a little bit more into the novel itself, for those who haven't read it yet, because at the library we do have a waiting list for your book.
I'm so glad.
Let me just share a brief synopsis with our audience. After a shocking discovery, Grace Woods, aka Mademoiselle Dubois, leaves her vast Australian sheep station and travels to tumultuous post-war Paris in order to find her true identity. While working as a mannequin for Christian Dior, the world's newly acclaimed emperor of fashion, Grace mixes with counts and princesses, authors and artists, diplomats and politicians. But when Grace falls for handsome Philippe Boye, she doesn't know that he is leading a double life, nor that his past might inflict devastating consequences upon her. As she is drawn into Philippe's dangerous world of international espionage, Grace discovers both the shattering truth of her origins and that her life is in peril. So that's quite a mouthful. Alexandra, could you please tell us a little bit about Grace Woods, the main character? What drew you to sharing her story, and how much of her story is truth versus fiction?
It relates to a previous book which I wrote, which was a memoir called Rosetta, about my scandalous great-grandmother, who was a respectably married, very young woman in Australia with a husband and a 5-year-old child, and she ran away with a half-Chinese fortune teller called Zeno the Magnificent. When this book came out, and it was a great scandal at the time, so it's very odd reading about your great-grandmother's adultery in the newspapers of the day. When it came out, I started to get letters and emails from all around the country, messages from people who wanted to share the scandal in their family. And usually it was complete strangers. Sometimes it was people I know. And one day it was a friend I had known for many years. I was sitting in her garden and we were talking about this phenomena of people wanting to share the skeletons in their closet. And she said, I don't think I've ever told you about my mother. And her mother was Grace Woods. When she told me about her mother's origins, I knew that they were so extraordinary and so unlikely that I had the basis for a book. And I immediately said to her, can I use your mother's life? Can I use this story? It was like falling in love, as the French say, coup de foudre. I was desperate to write this book. So she disappeared for a week, and after a week she came back and she said, I've talked to the family. Yes, you may write the story. And I couldn't wait to get going. So all of the early part, do you mind? I'm going to have to take you on a slight walking tour of my house because we've changed to my device. I'm going to have to find a charger. So we're walking through my house as I speak. So what happened was I used her mother's name. I used the parents that she grew up with's real name. I used her grandparents and I used all of her early life. And indeed, she did become a model. And yet I gave her a fictional life. So that blend of fact and fiction is something I like doing very much. It's something which I think in my books of historical writing brings the reader so much more deeply into the character.
Okay, we lost you for a moment, but you're back.
I'm back. I've got a whole new background, and I definitely won't lose you this time.
Perfect. Alexandra, there's a very interesting component to this book, the whole idea of biology and identity and who we are, and how important this component is. Can you talk a little bit about this to our audience?
Yes, it's a central theme of the book. Without giving away too much, there is a long-standing debate about nature and nurture. And it goes to what is a parent? Is the parent somebody who cares for you, who looks after you, who nurtures you? Or is it a matter of biology? And it's so central to identity. You mentioned that I worked as a psychotherapist, which I did for 10 years. And I remember a case with a young man who was engaging in various activities, let's say antisocial activities. It turned out he was the result of artificial conception. He had read somewhere that prisoners were used as donors, and he thought he was the son of a criminal. When he discovered that, in fact, his father was a medical student, it completely changed his sense of identity and who he was. After a tumultuous period, he came to understand, as we're talking here, what is the meaning of a parent, and also the cues and psychological effects that derive from our understanding of it. And we can see this in Grace Woods, aka Mademoiselle Dubois, and her journey, because she goes through these very same quite demanding journeys of self-discovery.
Another very interesting aspect to your novel is at some point I almost feel like it's two distinct novels because you have the whole Australian life and then the Parisian life, and they're juxtaposed in a very interesting and intricate manner, but they're so different that it almost feels like book one, book two, different journeys. Was that intentional? Was that sort of to shape the character and her growth?
I'm sorry, we're walking again because I would like to grab my book. What I wanted to show again was the way in which the country and the cities and the life where she resided echoed the growth in her character. Because as Christian Dior said, Australia was compared to Europe, a very simple country. It had never been invaded. Its men went to war, but it didn't know war. And in these pre-jet, pre-internet days, it was also quite cut off. So really, Grace is a simple person. She sees the world in black and white. When she goes, I'm sorry, I'm just plugging this in. When she goes to Europe, she encounters a much more complex world. It's a world where she discovers life is not about black and white, but it's about shades of grey.
Yes, and this is another topic that is pervasive throughout the novel. It's how does Grace deal with these various shades of gray, whether it's growing up in Australia and deciding whether she wants to make a promise to someone she may not be truly in love with, or does she continue this relationship with someone who may or may not be dangerous? So in both of these instances, she's kind of facing a gray area. Can you speak a little bit about those?
Well, I think, as you say, there is literally the boy next door who lives on what you would call, I guess, the ranch next door. There's an expectation because she's grown up as the daughter of very wealthy, we call them graziers, farmers. She's been educated privately. She dresses beautifully. And she will become a rather grand country lady and marry the appropriate person. This was a very typical narrative in those days. No matter who you were or what level of society you came from, as a woman, you did what was expected. But in Grace's life, she has a rupture. A moment comes, the moment I referred to earlier, where everything she has taken for granted about herself, her very identity, is challenged. And this unlocks a door. This is one of those chaotic moments that acts as a catalyst. And it is a door she can walk through or not. She can stay safe with her position, with her husband, or she can take off into the wild blue yonder, which in this case is Paris, because she needs to find out who she really is in a biological sense, but also in a much deeper psychic sense. So that really is her journey, and that is why she must go to Paris to find these terribly central matters of identity. But of course, along the way, she has a rather fabulous time, gets involved with many adventures, and meets a very complex man.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the colorful characters that are in the book, apart from the ones that she goes out with or has relationships with. In the background, there's also Picasso, there's also Jackie Onassis. Did this happen when you heard the story of Grace Woods? Were all of these people sort of part of the scene at this time? Were some there and some weren't?
Absolutely. Every person I have placed in Paris was in Paris. It's all completely historically accurate. So if it's Rita Hayworth buying her trousseau because she is marrying Prince Ali Khan at Christian Dior, then she is at Christian Dior. If I say that Jackie Bouvier, as she was then, was living in Paris and attending classes at the Sorbonne, she certainly was. The same with Picasso, the same with, and of course you have to understand that Dior was so sensational that every leading female figure in the world flocked there, from, you know, the Duchess of Windsor to the ballerina Dame Margot Fonteyn. Everybody was there. And that worked because everyone was flocking to Paris. See, during the war, Paris had been a closed city. It had been a locked casket. And because of arrangements made with the German occupiers, it was untouched, unlike all the other great European cities that were heavily bombed. You know, London was smashed, obviously Berlin was smashed, Vienna, all of these places. Paris was perfect. And it was a perfect secret. And suddenly, after World War II, it was open and everyone flocked there. So you have to imagine it's like awaking a sleeping beauty. So we have artists and we have philosophers and we have diplomats and we have politicians. We have refugees flooding in and we have the world's most glamorous people. So it was an exciting and challenging, glamorous time to be in Paris, with probably the one time in the world that had this intense concentration of not just the leaders of society, but the leaders of the arts, politics and diplomacy. And spies, lots of spies.
We definitely get that feeling of the energy that is, strong, and a place where everyone wants to be through your writing. So congratulations on conveying that feeling. The other thing that I loved personally was the descriptions of Grace at the Maison, getting fitted and with the toile. Can you tell us a little bit how you researched that or you knew about it? Because you seem to really have a deep understanding of what was going on at La Maison in those times.
Well, as I said, I am a fashion historian, so I had already developed a significant body of research and of knowledge. I've also been a board member of one of our leading museums, the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, colloquially known as the Powerhouse Museum, which has a very, very fine collection of historic and vintage garments from the world's designers. I was very fortunate because in the time in which I was writing was the 70th anniversary of Christian Dior, and I was able to attend a magnificent exhibition in Paris. I was also able to go to the exhibition. They were all slightly different in different cities. In London, they have this incredible 21st birthday dress of Princess Margaret. And of course, it was also here in Melbourne because of our close association with Christian Dior. So this gave me a fabulous opportunity to be very close to the garments and to study in greater depth the history and scope of his work. There's nothing like that first-hand experience. Of course, I read his autobiography and lots of other books as well.
Yes, it seems as though you are somewhat of an expert now on everything Dior, having attended a few of the exhibitions.
Oh, I don't.
So there is a very important love story in this novel between Grace and Philippe Boye. Can you tell us a little bit more about this intriguing character, Philippe Boye?
Grace has never met anybody like Philippe. He is completely unlike the farm boys that she knows from back home, nor is he like the French aristocrats that have been romancing her, the sort of men who like to have a Dior model on their arm. Philippe is quite curt, he's very clever, he's very attractive, but when she first meets him, he's a little condescending. I mean, after all, she's just a model. He has no idea, of course, that she has grown up on a farm, that during the war she's had to run that farm practically single-handed, and that she's just as comfortable on the back of a motorcycle as she is on a wild horse. They circle each other. She believes he's a journalist. They realise they have a meeting of minds. They are two of a kind. What she doesn't know is that they are both leading a double life. She is hiding her true identity, and so is he.
Yes, that was a very interesting component, because we, at this point, as she's getting closer to Philippe, know her secret and know what she's keeping from him. And we don't understand the extent to his secret, but of course it makes their story even more compelling that they each have these very big secrets that they're not telling one another.
And we also come to discover, of course, the consequences when you try to keep your past secret. So what a tangled web they weave. It leads to many complications. As you mentioned, he, in his other life, he poses as a journalist. He, in fact, works for the French Secret Service. And at that time, communism was extremely strong in France. Stalin had basically conquered Eastern Europe, and he was looking to France to be the second pincer that would squeeze Europe in his grasp. So there was all sorts of undercover work and daring-do going on. And as you will discover in the book, Grace Woods Dubois, which is the name she adopts in France, is called on to play a very dangerous, very specific role in foiling an assassination attempt that only she can do.
Can you tell us a little bit about the period where Grace, it's a different part of the book where Grace really sort of is somewhat in hiding. Was that aspect of the book, was that also based on research and on history, on facts?
Well, I know this comes under the heading of it's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it. But in addition to my city travels, I also had the great good fortune of travelling through the Loire Valley, of seeing the fabulous chateaus, and of learning something of their history. Some of the history of France is very dark during the Second World War. We like to think that most of the French were brave resistance fighters, and yet this is not true. There were many, many collaborators from all classes, as we can see in the book. The other strand, which was really fascinating to research, was looted art, the stolen art that the Nazis took. I don't want to say too much about that because I don't want to spoil the surprises for the readers. But in my mind, my research combines secondary sources, A lot of books and a lot of journals. Hopefully I can get to first-hand accounts of people of the time. But also I always walk the walk. So when it comes to her life, in Sydney, in the country, I walk the walk. When it comes to her life in Paris, everywhere that she went on the left bank, I went to. And it's the same with the Loire, although the chateau that I have named in the Loire is a fictional chateau. It combines the characteristics of some of the best-known, magnificent and ruined locations.
It's an interesting parallel, but we had another author in December. Her name is Kristen Harmel, and she was discussing her book, The Book of Lost Names. And there is quite a bit of mention of the looting of books. And I think a lot of us knew about the looting of art, but didn't know as much about the books. But there is one very important piece of art in your book that is mentioned. I won't give it away, but did that happen?
That happened. It is based on a painting by that particular artist that did disappear during the war. It was looted. I used that as inspiration to create another painting by that artist. In my book, well, you'll have to discover whether it is found or not. The real painting that inspired me has never turned up. It may still be out there somewhere in a chateau, in a basement, in an attic, we don't know. But it's so far not been discovered.
Very interesting. An interesting component of your book is, I guess, because it takes place in the 40s, and I'm not used to thinking this way, is a woman can just do whatever she wants. It's not exactly the same thing in the 1940s. Can you talk a little bit about women's rights and how this affected the book, or even consent issues show up in this novel? Can you talk a little bit about Grace as a woman and how important that is throughout the novel?
Well, in fact, women's rights, there wasn't a concept of women's rights. The man was the head of the household, and what he said went. And as I referred to earlier, although during the wartime, women had played leading roles in businesses, in factories, in public services, after the war, it was an extremely conservative time where the idea was that women stayed at home, looked after their husband, and had children, lots of children. The wage, and I'm not certain about Canada, up until just after the war, what is known here as the basic wage was 50% of a man's. And as a reward for service after the war, women got paid 75%. I mean, as if this was just this wonderful thing. So no matter what you did, even if you were working, you weren't recognised monetarily or really any other way. My greatest shock when I was researching this book comes when, of course, she is married and she needs to go to Paris. It is a very important moment in the book because she has to apply for a passport, which reveals certain things. But what it revealed to me was that an Australian woman could not be granted a passport to travel abroad without her husband's written permission until, wait for it, 1983. This gives you an idea of how restrained and restricted women were, and thank God of how far we've come.
Yes, this part about the passport was truly shocking. And especially when you add until the 1980s, it's even worse.
I know. It shocked me.
One of the characters that is quite an interesting character is Reuben. Can you tell us a little bit about how he came about?
Reuben is a real person. The friend of mine who told me her mother's story knew him as a friend of the family. And indeed, Grace grows up believing he is a close friend of the family. His physicality, his attributes, the fact that he is a rackety character, that he can wrangle any horse that comes his way and yet plays the piano superbly, is all real. That's all true. As is his, let us say, as is the way he relates to Grace's world, which is only uncovered very late in the book. And what the reader will find, which I will definitely not give away because it is the big reveal, and shocked me. The extraordinary thing about that, I wrote the manuscript and it was in at my publisher's, and my publisher said, I love this book, it's terrific, really happy with it. But that coincidence, that just seems, it's very far-fetched. Maybe you should look at that. And I said, that is what is real. You couldn't make it up, which just goes to show you that fact is not only a lot stranger but a lot wilder than fiction.
Definitely. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. There is something that Jackie says at some point in the novel to Grace that I quite like, and it is, if you don't take a gamble, you're less likely to make a mistake. Did she say that? And then she says, a world without risk is small and safe.
That is not a direct quote from her. It's actually something that I used to talk about a lot in therapy. But I feel that Jackie's life has lived that maxim out. So I felt very comfortable in giving her those words to say. I remember a wonderful report of her sitting at a dinner party and the gentleman next to her said, what is your greatest achievement? And she said, myself. Because she is a woman who took many risks. She took many risks. And she knew extraordinary grief and suffering. Obviously, the death of her husband, JFK, but also her stillborn child, her miscarriages. She had a pain and a grief, and yet she continued. She continued to create a wonderful, rich, vibrant life. So I felt she lived out that maxim.
And I feel like this was an important theme in the novel for Grace. It was maybe there was more of a reluctance in the beginning when she was more naive, but this need to persevere when the going gets tough or regardless of the circumstances definitely is an important theme, I believe, as the novel evolves.
And isn't it true that we really never know what lies within until we are tested? It's that baptism of fire. And that often comes when you dare. You can accept life and live within very comfortable parameters. But that is not Grace's destiny, because her true nature is to push beyond, to discover greater depths within herself, to live a larger life. And I think so many women of that time wanted to do that, were desperate to do that, a whole host of factors prevented them from doing so. But Grace had this one opportunity, and she had a very powerful motivation. And I do, I've become enormously fond of my characters, but to see her coming into her own, not as just a naive girl, not as a woman who takes her privilege for granted, but as somebody who is able to literally place herself in a life and death situation and to sacrifice that which is dearest to her is just wonderful. I found her wonderfully inspiring.
I agree, especially as the novel evolves and as her experiences broaden and she's sort of more aware that life isn't as she thought, so simple and easily packaged into a little box. Maybe she takes, she gets strength in that and she continuously grows and pushes herself. I don't think that same Grace, had she not gone through what she did and had those experiences, would have had the same outcome at the end had she just lived in Australia. I feel as though all of those things shaped her personality and her.
And yet, living in Australia was also a huge contribution.
Yes.
Because she wasn't bound by the rules of Europe. Once she stepped out of Australia and into Europe, and I often feel people like Aussies or indeed Canadians do really well around the world because they don't know the rules. They just know that they want to create something terrific and they go off and do it. They don't realise that you should be politely, knocking on the back door. You shouldn't be bowling up to life's front door. So I think that Australian background is very important for her. And I think also that she derived an enormous amount of strength from living on the land and from farming. And I felt it was extremely important. I know we talked earlier that the first part of the book is on the whole set in Australia, so that you really get that sense of the land and what it means to her, how it grounds her, and how it actually provides her in a funny way with a special kind of confidence. In that way, as Madame says in the atelier, you have something that our French girls don't have, a spirit. She has an élan, a confidence, a vivacity, which comes from that rural background.
The relationship with her father is also quite touching. I definitely enjoyed reading how close she was to her father in this novel. So without giving away too much more, I invite everyone to read The Paris Model or put your names down for it if you're not already on the wait list. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A or the chat. And Alexandra, I won't keep you too much longer, but could you tell us about your next project, The Royal Correspondent?
Thank you. I can. It's coming out here in just 2 weeks' time, and it will be available in the United States and Canada. They haven't set a date, but it's in the fall. We say autumn, but I know you say fall. The Royal Correspondent is about Blaze Hill. Unlike Grace, she comes the opposite. She comes from an impoverished inner city suburb. She's desperate to get out, to do better for her family, who are very, very poor. Her sister suffers from polio. She becomes a journalist. She is sent off in 1960 to London to cover the controversial wedding of Princess Margaret to a very unconventional photographer, Tony Armstrong-Jones. It's the dawn of the swinging 60s, and she gets drawn into a royal scandal, a real royal scandal. The Profumo affair, the Cold War, and two very complicated romantic entanglements.
Well, it sounds fabulous. We'll be definitely waiting to read that one as well, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just looking to see if I have any questions appearing. I'll give it a moment because sometimes it does take a moment for questions to appear. While I give it just a moment, one of the characters I didn't really speak about, but was also a very important character, was Olive. And could you tell us a little bit how Olive's grooming of Grace kind of shaped her life and helped her in her experiences?
Olive is a very traditional woman of her time, and she brings Grace up with the same values that she holds. She believes very strongly that Grace should follow in her footsteps, that she should be a somewhat grand lady of the land, beautifully dressed, beautifully groomed. She goes to Sydney for the races, but she does good works for the community. And, of course, Grace is her only child. She's enormously protective of her, protective to a fault. She wants to keep Grace near at all times. This is frustrating for Grace, and she doesn't understand why. In many ways, she loves her mother. Her mother introduces her to the world of fashion. They look at imported magazines together. And yet her mother is claustrophobic. She's suffocating her. So they have a complex relationship throughout the book, which, like all the relationships, develops and changes as more is revealed.
Thank you, Alexandra. I see something just came up in the chat from one of our attendees. She says, I loved your book. It was so enlightening and a wonderful
Thank
read. Since you knew who the family was of Grace Woods, and you mentioned her daughter was in Australia, did her real daughter end up living in Australia?
Her real daughter did end up living in Australia, the daughter that I call S. And although Grace Woods has now passed away, as you can imagine, I was very keyed up, very tense when I gave the manuscript to her daughter to read. I had told her that I was fictionalising large parts of her life, and yet the essential driver and then the essential secret that motivates her was all going to be there laid out on the page. I waited a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, thinking the worst. And I received a phone call from my friend who said, I love it. You've given Mum a life she would have loved to live. And she always said, when I go, you'll know where I am because I'll be dancing on the clouds. And she said, I think she's dancing right now. It was so touching.
That's beautiful. Yes, very touching. Well, thank you so much, Alexandra, for giving us your time today. And I know it's early for you and you look fabulous at 9, almost 10 a.m. your time.
Nothing like a good lipstick, I always say.
So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day. We really appreciate you joining us today and talking about your wonderful book.
It has been a great pleasure, and I hope we'll have the opportunity again, this time with no technical issues.
Yes, as do I. We'll certainly invite you back. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye,
Bye
everyone.
from Australia.
Thank you.